Coffee, the greatest smuggling operation in history. We call it a morning ritual. But if you strip away the branding and the barista's art, you are looking at the world's most successful smuggling operation. It all began not in boardrooms, but in the mud of the Ethiopian highlands around 850 AD. One shepherd, a herd of goats twitching with unnatural energy, and a red berry that promised to cheat the only thing a human cannot escape: exhaustion. From that moment, the bean didn't just spread, it made a break for it. It was put on trial in Mecca, smuggled out of Yemen, and used as fuel for Europe's industrial engines. It is a commodity that has toppled kings and built empires on the backs of the exploited. But before we open this case, as always, I would like to know, from which part of the world are you listening to me, and what time is it for you? Whether you are lying down to rest, trying to fall asleep, or simply interested in ancient beliefs, thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. Bonfires in Mecca. Fires burned in the streets of Mecca, not because of a murder, not because of a rebellion, because of coffee. Authorities dragged sacks of beans into the open, sliced them open, and poured the black treasure onto the stones. Someone struck a flint. Sparks flew. Smoke rose. The crowd watched as a new habit was turned into a public warning. Officials weren't arguing about taste. They were arguing about control. They saw a drink that kept people awake at night, talking in groups, exchanging rumors, organizing thoughts. They didn't need vigilant minds. They needed obedient bodies. Coffee entered this world accompanied by lies and panic. That says a lot. Ask 10 people how coffee appeared, and you will hear the same story. A shepherd named Kaldi in Ethiopia notices his goats leaping across the rocks. After chewing on red berries, he tries them. He feels a jolt of energy. A monk scolds him. A fire accidentally roasts the beans. The first cup appears. It sounds beautiful, marketable, like a tourist brochure with good lighting. But no one can prove it. There are no court records, no merchant ledgers, no dated 9th century manuscripts saying, Kaldi found coffee, and here is how much he charged for a sack. The legend lives because it flatters everyone. It gives Ethiopia the right to be called the birthplace. It gives monks a moral foundation. It gives coffee an origin story that helps sell mugs. History works differently. History is like smuggling. It glides over the water in the dark. It changes names. It finds new friends. It leaves bodies behind. Start with the plant. Coffee Arabica grows wild in the highlands of what we now call Ethiopia. This part is confirmed by science. Coffee did not appear in Yemen by spontaneous generation. Seeds do not fly across the Red Sea on prayers alone. People in the region knew about the berries long before anyone wrote about cups and cafes. A stimulant in a bright red skin doesn't stay a secret for long. Someone chewed it. Someone crushed it. Someone mixed it with fat as a travel ration. Humans experiment on everything they can swallow. Written records point to Arabia, to Yemen, to a time when the drink already looked like a system. This is important because systems attract power. Power attracts violence. When the drink appears in Yemen in historical chronicles, it arrives not as a cute novelty. It arrives as a tool. Sufis used it to stay awake during night prayers. A stimulant turns fatigue into a problem that can be solved with a bowl and hot water. Discipline makes institutions strong. Yemeni traders and rulers did not want coffee plants taking root anywhere else. They wanted everyone else to buy the beans that came from their hills and pass through their hands. So they resorted to a crude trick. They roasted the beans before export. 1. Roasting kills the seed. 2. A roasted bean cannot germinate. 3. The buyer cannot plant it. 4. The buyer is forced to return to the source for a new portion. This is the first real conspiracy in the history of coffee. Yemen played out an original scenario using fire and water. The port through which this traffic flowed had a name, Mocha. Mocha was the checkpoint. Coffee spread not because it was pleasant. Coffee spread because people paid for it. The drink reached Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, and everywhere it met the same question. What is this? What does it do to the mind? Who gathers around it? The real fear of the authorities did not come from the caffeine. The real fear came from the gatherings. A lonely person is easy to manage. Frighten him, buy him, confuse him with a sermon. But put men in the same room every night and they will start comparing notes. They will start telling stories about the tax collector. They will start laughing at the governor. They will start noticing patterns. Coffee houses created a new kind of public life. Authorities hate that. In Mecca, they burned the beans. In Cairo, they punished the merchants. In Istanbul, they tried to make drinking coffee a state crime. Authorities lose such battles. Coffee changed the daily schedule. It turned the night from private time into public time. It allowed a person to work longer without wine, but it also allowed him to think longer without sleep. A ruler can tolerate a tired population. A ruler can tolerate a drunk population. A ruler cannot tolerate a population that gathers after dark sober and angry. If you want a conspiracy, look at the gap between myth and documents. The myth says a shepherd found coffee, and everyone smiled. Documents say officials burned beans in the streets, and merchants guarded ports like fortresses. Mocha was a roadblock, and roadblock economics always end the same way. Someone bribes a guard. Someone steals a seed. Someone carries it out in a pocket or the lining of a robe. A single living seed can create a rival empire. Yemen knew this, and the shadows had already begun to lengthen. Would you like me to tell you how Dutch spice stole living trees? Or how coffee took over London and turned it into the world's financial center? Yemen didn't just grow coffee, it created an aura of sacrality and mystery around it. The religious frame around the drink worked as protection. It kept trade within the community and turned commerce into part of an identity. But coffee escaped anyway, because it had a property that made it inevitable. People couldn't stop thinking about coffee once they realized it worked. Sugar gives pleasure. Alcohol gives numbness. Coffee gives focus. In harsh conditions, focus is not a luxury, but survival. It helps you pray through the night, count money, steer a ship, memorize texts, and draft contracts. Coffee didn't need missionaries, it needed tired people. And the world has always had an abundance of those. Ethiopia gave the world the plant, but Yemen gave it the system. It was the system that shaped the modern world. Coffee brought with it the smell of roasting, the habit of late-night sittings, and an association with law and debate. It was a functional drink. Early consumers were not looking for comfort, they were looking for an effect. They wanted to stay in the game, to be sharper and faster than the competition. This motive would repeat in every era. Merchants need an edge, governments need revenue, and workers need endurance. They kicked in the doors at dawn, while the cups were still warm. Men tried to hide what had been in plain sight at night. Blackened pots, mills smelling of smoke, bowls with bitter residue. A judge would sign the warrant, a preacher would provide the justification, and a local enforcer provided the muscle. They didn't want the drink, they wanted to destroy the room that was born around it. Mecca and Medina lived off human traffic. Every year, pilgrims brought stories, diseases, and new appetites. Coffee fit perfectly into the schedule of a holy city that never slept. But the authorities met it with suspicion. Coffee houses gave strangers a reason to sit together without family ties. Add gossip, politics, and complaints about taxes and the room turns into a threat. The authorities knew. A tired person goes home, but an alert person stays and talks. Talk turns into planning faster than any ruler would like. In the early 16th century, trials of coffee began in Mecca. It was accused of intoxication, though the real fear was the sight of people lingering after prayer instead of dispersing. The burning of beans was turned into a spectacle, making coffee look like evidence from a crime scene. The drink moved on. In Cairo, a city of scholars and Sufi orders, coffee became the natural partner for night vigils. The cup kept the eyes open, and prayer kept the mind focused. But this social freedom, which required no wine, frightened the Malati police. Coffee houses became neutral territory where interests collided. Mamluk elites and merchants, scholars and street thugs, artisans and petty officials. Neutral ground allows ideas to jump from one circle to another. This terrifies systems built on hierarchy. When authorities closed coffee houses, owners went underground, serving the drink in private homes, or renaming establishments places for poetry. Most bans failed because regimes operate not on discipline, but on deals. And coffee thrived on deals. Istanbul turned coffee into infrastructure. Here, coffee houses became markets of information. Letters were delivered there, gossip from the docks and news from the borders were retold. A coffee house didn't just sell caffeine, it sold an audience. Sultans and viziers feared these halls, where poets could destroy a minister with a single line and satirists turned authority into a laughingstock. Sultan Murad entered history as a man who personally hunted down tobacco smokers and coffee lovers, viewing them as enemies of obedience. Coffee didn't cause paranoia, it gave paranoia a target. Coffee became a political technology. It taught people to gather for hours, exchange information, and create rituals. You might call it culture, but in reality, it's a network. Before coffee houses, people met in mosques or guilds, where there were always gatekeepers, priests, or masters. The coffee house, however, was a space in between. Anyone with a small coin could enter and listen. Such access always irritates the elite. Moreover, coffee changed the very nature of communication. 1. Alcohol loosens tongues and blurs memory. A drunk forgets promises. 2. Coffee binds tongues and sharpens memory. A caffeinated person remembers what you said and will repeat it tomorrow. This makes coffee a dangerous companion for any corrupt system, as corruption relies on forgetfulness. While rulers sought ways to ban the drink, theologians adjusted doctrines. When they needed to close coffee houses, coffee was called an intoxicant. When they needed to collect taxes, they found a way to legalize it. In an era of low literacy, coffee houses functioned like newspaper editorial offices without an editor. A merchant from a neighboring town could laugh in the face of a governor's official statement about stability and list by name everyone killed in a recent riot. Yemen still controlled production, and every cup drunk fed the monopoly of mocha. But this power had already attracted the attention of those accustomed to taking what does not belong to them. European merchants discovered coffee, not from advertising brochures, but by following the clink of coins. Ottoman control over key routes created another political layer. Coffee traveled within an imperial system that could tax it, regulate it, and punish for it. But it also moved along trails that smugglers knew better than any official. The Red and Arabian Seas became the arena for an eternal game between customs and illegal cargo. The cities of the Middle East became the training ground for coffee's next life. There, they developed the rituals, the brewing methods, and the very idea that coffee is an integral part of public discussion. There, too, a state response was formulated, consisting of 3 parts: bans, taxes, and surveillance. Bans rarely worked for long, the habit was too useful. Taxes worked better, they allowed the ruler to profit while pretending to tolerate the custom. But surveillance was the most effective tool. The coffee house offered a simple solution to a complex task. Instead of catching whispers in back alleys, you plant an informant at the door, and the whisper comes to you. Here, the noir becomes literal. Coffee houses attracted snitches as much as poets. A suspicious government will always find someone who needs money or revenge. In such places, an innocent joke could lead to a courtroom the very next day. People understood this and adapted. They spoke in codes, riddles, and used humor. Every closure of a coffee house only proved its importance. Regimes do not pick fights with things they do not fear. A customs clerk in Venice opens a bale that smells wrong. Not pepper, not cloves, not the sweet rot of nutmeg. Something darker, burnt, and sharp. He sees the merchant smiling too calmly, as if the cargo has already paid for the services of the judge, the priest, and the patrolman. The clerk makes a mark in ink that will not matter, because the city rests on trade, and trade is always more important than caution when margins are high. Europe discovered coffee, not as a drink, but as a product with a criminal past. The black liquid was inextricably linked to Islamic cities, night rooms full of talk, bans, and raids. When, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, sacks began to arrive through Venetian canals and Levantine brokers, Europeans didn't ask, "What does it taste like?" They asked, "Who drinks it? Who profits from it? And what does it do to the mind?" Europe already knew the price of stimulants: wine, beer, tobacco, and sugar. It had learned the lesson. A popular stimulant always gives someone power. The only question is to whom. Doctors argued over it as a medicine, the clergy as a contagion, and the state calculated how to tax the habit, without turning it into a meeting place threatening order. The continent pretended to fear foreign influence while buying it by the ton. Europe never rejects the outside world, it repackages it and claims rights to it. As soon as it finds a way to extract profit. The clergy initially tried to control taste as a moral category. Priests whispered that the devil had brewed this drink in Mecca, and warned of a religious infection in the beans. The cynicism of the situation lay in the timing. As long as the drink remained expensive and rare, the panic was manageable. But when merchants began promoting it more aggressively, and the habit threatened to go beyond elite circles, the panic grew teeth. Europe feared not the taste of coffee, but the coffeehouse, the fact that ordinary people would meet without permission, and trade information outside official channels. At some point, the church faced a dilemma. Bans didn't work without costly enforcement. A famous story emerged. Advisors urged the Pope to condemn coffee as Muslims will, but he tasted it, loved it, and blessed it. If for some, this is a charming anecdote, for me, it is classic damage control. The church always knew how to neutralize a threat by absorbing it. As soon as the supreme authority gives the go-ahead, local priests stop considering the habit heresy and start considering it acceptable commerce. An institution doesn't fight the tide, it declares the tide its own property. Having established itself, Europe did what it does best: built infrastructure around vice and called it progress. The coffeehouse arrived not quietly, but as a business model. It offered a sober alternative to taverns, a place for merchant deals, a platform for writers seeking patrons, and a space for politicians testing their arguments in public. A coffeehouse concentrates the city in one room. You call it culture. I call it a gift for intelligence services. Any government adores places that pull an entire network of contacts to a single address. In mid-17th century London, this movement was lightning fast. In a few decades, hundreds of coffeehouses opened, and each became a magnet for a specific crowd. Merchants gathered in one, lawyers in another, sailors in a third. This specialization created an information economy on caffeine. A ship captain could walk in and hear the latest gossip on insurance rates, a trader about wars closing trade routes, a pamphleteer about a scandal with a minister. Everything happened faster than official proclamations. Modern finance was born in these halls, not because coffee made people smarter, but because it made such a room possible. People no longer had to shout over drunken songs or wade through spilled beer. They sat, listened, wrote, and negotiated. The elites realized that a cup for a penny gave access to knowledge that previously belonged to guilds and courts. And when knowledge becomes cheap, the old gatekeepers lose their leverage. That is something rulers never forgive. Coffee offered exactly that. Therefore, the same elites who condemned the drink as alien when it threatened their identity began to accept it when it improved the labor market supply. Critics attacked coffee with medical horror stories and moralizing plays. They warned that it dried the blood, weakened men, inflamed passions in women, sterilized bodies, and ruined households. These claims sound ridiculous now, but then they seemed plausible because early modern Europe treated medicine as a battlefield of competing theories and commercial interests. And since moral panic always borrows medical language, it gives fear a respectable appearance. However, the pattern is more important than the details. Opponents used any argument capable of slowing the spread because they understood. Coffee doesn't just change digestion, it changes the street. It replaced the tavern as the place where men made sense of public life. And this shift threatened anyone who relied on a population that was either isolated or drunk. The state responded, as it always responds, when it senses a new kind of gathering. It tried to regulate. It tried to ban. It tried to embed agents. In England, the fear became explicit when the Crown tried to close coffee houses in 1672. Officials described them as places spreading false news and sowing discontent. The language sounds almost modern if you remove the archaic terms. The same accusation appears in every era of media shift. The state sees a new channel of information. It calls it dangerous. It calls it false. It claims to protect society. In reality, it is protecting itself. The attempt failed because coffee houses had already embedded themselves into commercial life. Merchants needed them. Writers needed them. Even government agents needed them because they used them to gather information. You cannot close a system you already rely on without cutting your own throat. This is the moment when coffee stops looking like an imported drink and starts looking like an imported weapon that Europe is learning to wield, not as a moral or civilizing force, but as a tool for building networks. Because the coffee house created a new kind of public sphere where money, news, and politics could mix without a formal invitation. The ruling classes of Europe had a complex relationship with such openness. They liked it when it generated markets. They hated it when it generated dissent. And coffee generated both. The hypocrisy manifested in how the authorities treated coffee houses. In moments of tension before a war or during rumors of conspiracies, officials intensified surveillance. They stationed informants. They monitored pamphlets. They tracked who met with whom. They used coffee houses as traps. Coffee house owners played along because they needed licenses, protection, and wanted to avoid closure. An owner who allows the police to sit in the corner can keep selling cups. Commerce, over time, turns everyone into collaborators. Patrons adapted too. They learned to joke in codes. They learned to change the subject when a stranger entered. They learned to treat every public room as a room with ears. This means that coffee houses trained Europeans in paranoia as much as in debate. A noisy city adores a place where everyone is watching everyone else. Coffee also quietly altered European colonial ambitions. Having tasted it and built their habits, Europeans faced the same vulnerability as the Middle East: dependence on a supply chain controlled by someone else. Yemen held the key for a long time. Mocha still mattered. Ottoman roots still mattered. Any war, blockade, or policy change could alter the price and access. Europeans did not tolerate dependence when they saw profit on the other side of control. As soon as coffee became a mass habit, European powers began to look at the plant the same way they looked at sugarcane and tobacco, as a crop that could be moved to their own colonies. This decision came not from curiosity, but from the fear of being at the mercy of another's will. The history of European coffee is often presented as a fairy tale of the Enlightenment, of rational men in clean rooms discussing ideas over a hot drink. This version hides the mechanisms. It hides the spies, the price games, and the propaganda. It hides a simple fact. The coffee house was a business selling access to information. And information always provokes a struggle for power. A minister can endure a private insult, but he cannot endure a public narrative that is carried daily through hundreds of rooms. Coffee houses did not just distribute narratives, they minted them. They took a raw rumor and turned it into something repeatable. They taught people to talk about politics as if politics belonged to them. And that is the real scandal. Look at what coffee displaced in Europe. It displaced the tavern as the default meeting place for many townspeople. It displaced morning ale for those who could afford the change. It displaced certain forms of church gatherings, not because coffee made people secular, but because it created a competing social ritual that did not require the participation of the clergy. Any ritual without the clergy slowly weakens its authority. These small portions accumulate over decades. The church understood this. Governments understood this. Merchants understood this. And the most cynical players saw it as an opportunity. Coffee houses offered a place to recruit supporters, sell ideas, create clubs, coordinate boycotts, plan protests, print pamphlets, and hire muscle. Once you see this, The image of the polite coffeehouse begins to seem like merely a costume worn over a backroom. A Dutchman exits a guarded garden with a living coffee plant and does not look back. If he looks back, he might betray his fear, and fear leads to a search to capture. In this business, they don't give botany lectures for being caught, they offer a cell, a knife in a back alley, or a quiet deal where the employer pretends you never existed. And this single plant is more important than the person carrying it. Empires are held together not by loyalty, but by levers of influence. And a living coffee sapling is a lever you can plant in the ground. Europe stopped pretending it needed coffee as a cultural accessory the moment the habit turned into a daily necessity, and a daily necessity turns a supply chain into a bottleneck. Yemen held a monopoly through mocha, roasting, and tight control. Europe had already learned the basic rule of raw commodities. You can either pay the gatekeeper forever or steal the gate. Europe always chooses theft if the math adds up. The Dutch did not wait for permission. They built a corporate empire in plain sight and called it commerce. The Dutch East India Company operated like a state with improved bookkeeping. It waged wars, negotiated, and toppled rivals. As soon as the agents realized that Yemen's dominance relied on keeping plants alive only in Yemen, they targeted the only thing that mattered: living plants capable of reproduction. The Dutch moved them to their controlled territory and found a place where coffee could flourish under their flag. Java. Colonial coffee expanded, not as a soft agro experiment, but as a power project. The powers planted it in the tropics not out of a love for the taste, but for stable supplies independent of Muslim ports. And as soon as coffee became a plantation crop, the story turned ugly. Plantations do not run on free labor, they run on coercion and violence. The French did not want to buy coffee from Dutch competitors or through the Middle East. They had a network of Caribbean colonies already set up for sugar production, and filled with enslaved people. Coffee fit into this system quickly, as it did not require massive mills like sugar. A coffee tree needs land, shade, and hands. And colonial systems always have hands, because they import them. This part of history reads like a robbery, because it was a robbery. A French naval officer, Gabriel Declieux, supposedly took a coffee sapling from the Royal Botanical Garden and transported it across the Atlantic to Martinique in the early 18th century. This story is told with heroic pathos. Storms, pirates, sharing the last drops of water. But behind the romance lies a redistribution of economic power. One sapling is industrial espionage with leaves. Martinique turned it into a money-printing press. Planters cleared lands, expanded production, and soon coffee captured Saint-Domingue, Haiti. Saint-Domingue turned coffee into a machine. There, a system of extraction was already perfected, treating humans as replaceable parts. The same overseers who whipped the cane cutters could whip the coffee pickers. And European consumers saw none of this. They saw a fashionable drink in Paris and a new ritual in London. They did not see the plantations, because distance works like an anesthesia. By the end of the 18th century, Saint-Domingue supplied a massive share of the world's coffee. Depending on the year and the accounting system, you see figures hovering around half. And even if you challenge this percentage, the basic fact remains. One small territory under French control became the main engine of world coffee supplies, and it did so thanks to forced labor and a plantation regime that kept people in chains and worked them to exhaustion. Coffee was not the cause of this cruelty. Coffee profited from it, and profit breeds silence. Because people benefiting from a commodity rarely invite journalists to check the source. This colonial expansion did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within European competition for world dominance, and coffee became another asset in this struggle. Dutch coffee from Java began circulating in European markets, and earned a reputation as a reliable commodity. French coffee from the Caribbean competed with volume. British merchants sought ways to secure their own sources. Every power wanted a flow of beans that would maintain caffeine levels in its cities, and profitability for its merchants. And the conflict over coffee was not just about cups. It was about strategic independence. because a city that depends on a rival for a popular product becomes vulnerable to price shocks and embargoes. And European powers feared vulnerability more than hypocrisy. They also feared each other's marketing, because coffee became a brand even before branding received its modern name. People spoke of mocha as a sign of origin and quality. Then they began applying this label to beans grown nowhere near Yemen, because trade does not respect geography. It respects a story that sells. And European merchants easily sold colonial coffee under names implying ancient authenticity. The buyer in Europe wanted a certain taste and a certain status. The buyer did not demand a verified supply chain. Thus, colonial coffee could ride on Yemen's reputation, while simultaneously undermining its market share. And that is how you kill an old monopoly. You steal the product and you steal the name. The moment coffee cultivation spread beyond Yemen, the original keepers of the gates lost their leverage. Mocha still shipped beans. Yemen still grew coffee on its hills. Merchants still tried to control exports. Nevertheless, the market began to change shape. European buyers gained options, and options weakened the supplier. Therein lies the quiet violence of markets. You don't need cannons, an alternative supply is enough. And Europe created this alternative by planting coffee in colonies, where it could force labor and ship goods as it saw fit. The question of labor is at the center of this chapter, because labor defines scale, and scale defines dominance. Coffee plants require time to mature. They require care. They require picking during the harvest, and the harvest requires patient hands, which is another way of saying it requires many people performing repetitive work for long hours. And European colonizers solved this problem the only way they knew how. In the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, they forced labor through slavery and coercion. Then they presented the resulting coffee as a clean consumer product. Plantation owners did not need to invent a new cruelty for coffee. They adapted existing cruelty. They created work gangs. They introduced quotas. They punished for shortfalls. They used violence as a management method. And when consumers in Europe praised coffeehouses as places of rational debate, they rarely acknowledged that these rational debates ran on irrational cruelty across the ocean, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the system rewarded ignorance. If you don't know, you don't have to worry. And if you don't have to worry, you can finish your cup and move on. Then the system broke where it mattered most. Saint-Domingue exploded in rebellion at the end of the 18th century. Enslaved people rose and began to fight. They burned plantations. They killed overseers. They drew France into an exhausting war it did not expect. And the Haitian Revolution did more than just change a flag. It shook the world's coffee supplies. Because when a colony supplying a huge portion of the world's coffee plunges into chaos, coffee prices react, merchants scramble, and competing producers smell opportunity. Here, the history of colonial coffee begins to resemble a power vacuum with beans, because the fall of one supply center created space for others, and the most important of these became Brazil. Not yet the all-overpowering titan it would become later, but already a landmass with a climate suitable for coffee, and a ruling elite ready to exploit labor. On a massive scale, coffee reached Brazil through a story that also resembles a robbery. A Portuguese agent named Francisco de Melo Parreira supposedly obtained seeds, or saplings from French Guiana, in the early 18th century. Some accounts add seduction, diplomacy, and hidden pockets. Again, the details change. The template remains the same. European powers treated coffee plants as strategic assets. They stole them. They transported them. They planted them where they could control the outcome. Because control over coffee meant control over revenue and global influence. Brazil had two advantages that made it a natural candidate for coffee dominance: vast lands and a labor system built on slavery that lasted deep into the 19th century. Plantation owners in Brazil expanded coffee cultivation into regions suitable for the crop. They pushed into the Pará Valley and later into areas that fueled the growth of São Paulo, and they used slave labor to scale. Because coffee does not care about your laws. Coffee cares about water. soil, and hands. And Brazil had all three in quantities that matter for a commodity empire. As Brazil grew, other regions joined the game. The Dutch did not limit themselves to growing coffee in Java. It spread across parts of Southeast Asia under European influence. The French pushed coffee into their other colonies. The British experimented in their domains, and the coffee map began to resemble the sugar map. A collection of tropical and subtropical zones exploited to fuel European consumption, where profits flowed in one direction and suffering in the other. At this stage, Europe effectively did two things simultaneously. It broke free from the Yemeni gates and tethered coffee to colonial exploitation. These two steps worked in tandem because colonial production allowed for scale, and scale allowed for lower prices. Lower prices turned coffee from a luxury into a mass habit. A mass habit generated even greater demand, justifying further expansion. This is the same feedback loop seen with sugar, and it always yields the same result: immense wealth for those controlling the trade and the land, and an immense human toll for those doing the work. Europe also built the commercial systems necessary to process coffee on a global scale. Because growing the crop is only half the battle, it must be transported, insured, financed, stored, and sold in a way that stabilizes supply and reduces risks for merchants. This is where finance and colonialism openly shake hands. Merchants use credit. Future contracts began to form in an embryonic state. Insurers calculated the cost of voyages. Warehouses held stockpiles. Brokers speculated on price changes linked to weather, war, and rebellions. Every layer of this system drained profit away from the producer toward the market centers of Europe, because that is what markets do when they are closer to capital than to the soil. The spread of coffee through colonial networks also changed the cultural narrative in Europe. Because once coffee became a colonial product, Europeans began to speak of it as part of their own economic identity. They stopped treating it as a foreign Muslim drink and began to perceive it as a normal feature of European life. This shift was not just about taste, it was about ownership. When your empire grows a crop, it feels domestic, even if it grows on stolen land. This mental trick matters because it lowers resistance to consumption. It transforms a formerly suspicious drink into a symbol of modernity and productivity. In practical terms, coffee houses in Europe benefited directly from colonial expansion. They gained access to more beans at more stable prices. They could serve more customers. They could become an integral part of urban life. As coffee consumption expanded, so did the political and commercial roles of the coffee houses. They continued to serve as markets for information and meeting places. And now they also served as nodes in a larger imperial economy. A man in London drinking a cup now sat at the end of a chain stretching across Caribbean plantations, Brazilian estates, or Javanese farms. He did not need to know this to benefit. The colonial chapter also includes another quiet conspiracy: the manipulation of origin and quality through names and marketing. Once multiple regions began producing coffee, merchants needed ways to differentiate and raise prices, so they used place names as branding tools. They invoked mocha. They invoked Java. They invoked bourbon. They invoked exotic images that hid the base reality of plantation farming. The names worked because consumers wanted romance and merchants wanted margins, and the truth of production remained conveniently distant. Even the term Java became synonymous with coffee in some contexts, showing how deep the impact of the Dutch shift was. Yemen did not just lose market share, it lost cultural centrality. The center shifted to where the empire could coerce production, and eventually, the center shifted to Brazil. This era also teaches a broader lesson about how raw commodities changed geopolitics. Coffee became a strategic crop because it fueled a social and economic habit, upon which European cities became dependent. And dependence breeds politics. Governments and trading companies supported colonial coffee not out of charity, but out of self-interest. They wanted cheap supplies. They wanted tax revenue. They wanted merchant dominance. They wanted to undermine rivals. And they wanted to avoid the humiliation of depending on a region outside their control for something their population demanded daily. If you strip away the sentimental stories, the colonial expansion of coffee looks like a set of coordinated decisions driven by the same logic. Steal the plant, seize the land, control the labor, ship the products. Tell a clean story to the consumer, repeat. The clean story usually focuses on the cup, the cafe, the aroma, and the so-called sophistication of European social life. The dirty story lives in the fields, in shipping manifests, and in the rebellions that periodically interrupted supply. This dirty story also prepared the next phase because, once coffee became a global commodity produced on a mass scale, industrial players began to standardize it, process it faster, package it, brand it, and sell it as a modern necessity. Industrialization did not replace exploitation, it simply changed the form of the profit. It shifted even more power into the hands of corporations and created new kinds of control. Through pricing, advertising, and global agreements, people shoveled coffee like coal not because they liked the smell, but because they had to destroy it, and they did it in broad daylight. In a country that grew so much coffee, it could not sell it without crashing its own market. This spectacle made no sense until you followed the money. Trains ran, furnaces roared, warehouses emptied, and the world watched as the government turned breakfast into fuel, while hungry families elsewhere lined up for bread because coffee had stopped behaving like a drink and started behaving like a weapon aimed at prices. If you look for the moment coffee became modern, you will constantly stumble upon the same scene. Brazil in the early 20th century. Mountains of beans, too many hands, too much land, too much supply, too little control, and a state that decided it would rather burn wealth than surrender power, because Brazil had already taken the driver's seat in the coffee trade. Once a country gains such a market share, it starts thinking like a cartel. Even using polite words, it begins to ask how to drive up prices, how to punish rivals, how to maintain the loyalty of planters, and how to make the world market stop treating its primary exports as disposable cargo. These questions did not remain in the fields, they moved into ministries, banks, shipping firms, and exchange floors where men in suits traded coffee as they traded metal and grain with distance and indifference. Brazil's dominance was based on scale, and scale was based on land, labor, and a brutal readiness for expansion. But the industrial age did not reward scale for its own sake. It rewarded scale plus processing, scale plus storage, scale plus branding, scale plus the ability to turn a fragile crop into a stable product that could survive transport, sit on a shelf, and taste the same every time. Because uniformity sells. The new coffee economy valued uniformity more than origin, predictability more than the farmer, and the story on the tin more than the conditions on the plantation. Thus, the industrial era of coffee began with a mismatch. The crop remained agricultural and chaotic, the market demanded industrial and controlled. This mismatch created a niche for a different kind of power, not the power of the planter with a whip or the merchant with a ship, but the power of the processor with machines and capital, the power of the brand that could buy beans anywhere, blend them, roast them, grind them, package them, and sell them, telling the buyer the product arrived from some imaginary place smelling of purity. And the buyer believed it because the buyer wanted routine, not investigations. The industrial system required several inventions and habits, none of which looked glamorous. Roasting moved from small batches to industrial drums that could handle volumes and standardized taste. Grinders became tools of mass production rather than artisanal gadgets. Packaging improved so that roasted coffee did not go stale in a matter of days. Business learned to ship coffee, not as a raw curiosity, but as a finished consumer good. Every step pulled value away from the place of origin toward the factory, because the factory controlled the transformation, and transformation controls the profit. Look at the example of the United States to see how quickly industry can domesticate a foreign commodity. Early Americans already drank plenty of coffee, partly because politics had pushed them away from tea. They treated coffee as a substitute, and later as a necessity. As cities grew and working hours turned into rigid schedules, employers and workers began to see coffee as a tool, a way to keep the shift moving, a way to keep the clerk awake, a way to keep the factory floor functioning. Demand rewarded anyone who could deliver coffee reliably and cheaply, which meant companies that could roast, package, and distribute at scale. Packaging was a quiet revolution because roasted coffee spoils quickly when exposed to air and moisture, and stale coffee kills repeat business. Companies fought for methods to keep oxygen out and flavor in. Once they solved this, they turned coffee into a shelf-stable item that could be bought without visiting a roaster, changing the entire retail chain. This moved coffee from specialized shops to general stores. It turned the product into something a housewife could buy as easily as flour. It also gave companies a reason to advertise, because branded packaging only matters when consumers recognize and trust it. Trust comes through repetition, slogans, and the sense that the product has a personality, a ridiculous concept for roasted seeds. Yet it worked because people don't just buy chemicals, they buy confidence. Here, the Noah's story moves from ports and plantations to offices and advertising copy. Because a brand doesn't just sell coffee, it sells a version of life, where coffee solves problems without creating them. This version requires selective memory. It needs a buyer who does not imagine the plantation or the burned warehouse. It needs a buyer who imagines a clean kitchen and a sturdy husband heading to work with a cup in his hand. Companies built this image with the same ruthlessness that empires used to seize ports. Look at the language that appeared in coffee advertising as industrial producers grew. They promised vigor. They promised clarity. They promised domestic harmony. They turned coffee into a sign of respectability. They built campaigns targeting women as managers of the household, and men as workers in need of stamina. The campaigns rarely spoke of origin, because origin raised questions, and questions slow down consumption. Thus, the industry shifted coffee away from geographical truth toward a lifestyle fiction, not a poetic fiction, but a commercial one. One that holds on through repetition until it begins to seem like common sense. Industrialization also changed taste, not by accident, but by design. Large-scale roasters blended beans from different regions to smooth out inconsistencies and drive down costs. They roasted darker to mask effects and create a powerful, uniform profile. They ground the beans finer or coarser, depending on brewing trends. They trained the public palates to accept whatever their machines produced most efficiently, and once the public accepted it, they could purchase cheaper green beans and still sell a consistent product. This meant the consumer learned to love the taste of technological solutions, not necessarily the taste of the harvest. This shift gave brands leverage over producers. Because the producer was no longer selling a unique flavor, the producer was selling a raw material that the factory could manipulate. Then came the upheavals that always accelerate industrial systems. War and economic crisis. Because war requires logistics, and crisis requires cost-cutting, coffee found itself right at the intersection of these paths. Soldiers drank coffee, workers drank coffee, and governments wanted coffee because it helped maintain morale and productivity. Companies wanted military contracts because contracts guaranteed volume. Every time a government tries to feed an army, it creates a market for stable stimulants. This is where instant coffee enters the story with a vengeance. Instant coffee did not arise from romance, it arose from the desire to make coffee portable, cheap, and fast. Inventors had tinkered with instant coffee before. Companies perfected it later. The key point here isn't the exact date of a patent, the key point is the motive. Instant coffee allowed a company to sell caffeine without the fuss of grinding and brewing. It also allowed armies and charities to distribute coffee in a form convenient for transport. And once millions of people adopt a habit under pressure, they often keep it when the pressure subsides. Habits form quickly when they are tied to survival and routine. Nestle's entry into the coffee market in the 20th century shows how corporate power reorganized the commodity. Brazil faced chronic overproduction and falling prices at times. Brazilian leaders tried various tactics to stabilize the market. They stockpiled coffee, they restricted exports, they destroyed reserves, and they sought industrial outlets capable of absorbing the volume. Industrial firms looked at this surplus and saw an opportunity. A company that could turn cheap surplus beans into a branded instant product could extract profit while producers and governments panicked. And a company that could sell this product globally could escape the constraints of any single market. Because a global brand does not need a single origin. It needs a reliable stream of raw material and a reliable stream of buyers. Instant coffee helped create this global flow. Now, return to the image of burning coffee, because it reveals the internal logic of the industrial era. Brazil burned coffee not because it hated waste, but because it feared collapse. Coffee prices plummeted during the Great Depression. A country that relied heavily on coffee exports faced a crisis akin to a national catastrophe. Officials chose destruction as a policy tool. They treated coffee as excess inventory threatening the entire system. Because when supply exceeds demand, the market punishes the producer, and the producer either accepts the punishment or fights the market. Brazil chose to fight, and it fought by making the coffee disappear, which sounds insane until you remember that power over commodities often means you can destroy value to protect price. All producers do this. Diamond cartels do this. And coffee producers did it too when the stakes demanded it. This is not a story about a single villain. It is a story about incentives. And incentives reward cruelty in polite forms. You don't need a whip to exploit a farmer when a global price crash can do the job for you. You don't need a gun to drive a worker into debt when the plantation store can trap him. You don't need chains when you can lock an entire region. Interdependence on a single export commodity. Industrial coffee amplified this dependence, turning coffee into a truly global necessity, a thing millions of people expected every morning, which meant governments and companies treated the coffee supply as something they needed to manage. And management in commodity markets rarely looks humane. It looks like stockpiling, quotas, price supports, propaganda, and quiet deals between exporters and financiers. Industrialization also pulled coffee into the logic of exchanges and speculation. Traders began to treat coffee as a paper product. They bought and sold future deliveries. They created instruments that allowed them to profit from price fluctuations. These instruments changed the mechanism of power. Once financiers can make money on volatility, they stop fearing it, they start to use it, and the producers suffer the consequences. Producers cannot easily hedge risks. Producers cannot move crops quickly. Producers cannot survive long periods of low prices without debt, while traders can click a deal and walk away. Thus, the industrial era created an expanding gap between the people who touched the tree and the people who touched the profit. This gap became structural. It didn't depend on one bad actor, it depended on the system itself. On the consumer end, industrial companies turned coffee into a symbol of modern life. Not just a drink. Coffee became the smell of the office, the break room, the diner, the station. Coffee became part of the factory schedule, part of the clerk's entrance, part of the soldier's kit, part of the student's nightly ritual. As coffee became embedded in daily life, companies learned to sell it using emotional triggers: comfort, reliability, productivity, belonging. This created a new level of control. When a product becomes a ritual, consumers forgive a lot. They forgive mediocre taste. They forgive vague labeling. They forgive price hikes. They forgive the fact that the product arrived through a chain they never inspect. This forgiveness becomes a true asset. It allows companies to shape the market. Decaffeination also appeared, revealing how the industry expands the market by neutralizing risk. Some people wanted the ritual without the jitters. Some doctors blamed coffee for nervousness. Some moralists blamed it for insomnia. The industry responded by offering a version that claimed safety while maintaining the habit. Decaf did not exist to protect public health, it existed to keep customers buying. When fear threatened demand because every raw commodity industry learns the same trick. Don't argue with consumer anxiety. Sell the product that pretends to solve it. Espresso culture, spreading through parts of Europe, also fits into this era as a form of industrial efficiency disguised as style. Coffee machines used pressure and heat to quickly produce a concentrated drink. They suited urban life, where people wanted a quick jolt and a social stop. As machines improved, cafes could serve more customers in less time. This efficiency mattered because coffee always balances on the edge between ritual and throughput. A cafe can sell atmosphere, but it still needs to sell cups. Therefore, innovations in equipment meant as much as innovations in roasting. Technology changed taste and behavior. It created a culture of short, intense consumption. It also created new markets for equipment, maintenance, and training. The industrial coffee system never sells just beans, it sells tools, expertise, and branded experiences. The industrial era also simplified the narrative of coffee's origin for a mass audience. Because myths make marketing easier, companies and popular writers repeated stories like the Legend of Kaldi. Because the story feels harmless, it cleanses the past. It replaces violence and monopoly with a cute anecdote about animals. This repetition served a purpose. It protected the consumer's conscience without requiring them to ask questions. When a story protects consumption, the industry keeps it alive. This is how myths become part of the supply chain. By mid-century, coffee had become something close to a global necessity, not in a biological sense, but in a cultural and economic one. Factories ran on it. Militaries relied on it. Office workers demanded it. Advertisers sold it as domestic glue. Trade flowed through mass producers like Brazil, through corporate roasters, and through instant coffee giants that could shape consumer tastes and manage supply shocks. At the same time, the system remained unstable. Weather could destroy a harvest. War could disrupt shipping. Revolutions could erase plantations. Price collapses could ruin producers. Every instability created an opportunity for players with capital, warehouses, and influence. Because these players could survive the downturns, buy low, sell high, and sustain the consumer market while the producers absorbed the pain. A boardroom fills with people who have never picked a coffee cherry in their lives. People in neat suits, with clean hands and polished shoes. They talk about the weather in Colombia as if they own the sky. They talk about hunger in Central America as if it's a rounding error. They move papers across the table that will decide if entire regions eat well or take out loans. They will never repay. Outside the room, people stand in lines for visas, wages, and work. Because coffee has a way of turning agriculture into geopolitics once the habit goes global. The era of coffee power begins when governments stop treating it as a simple trade item and start perceiving it as a strategic raw material capable of stabilizing or destabilizing entire countries. By the middle of the 20th century, coffee had become one of the most valuable exports for much of Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Coffee money sponsored governments, paid off external debts, bought weapons, built roads, and kept elites in power. When a single crop props up a state, that state becomes vulnerable to price fluctuations, and vulnerability attracts foreign influence. Because foreign powers prefer influence through markets when they can get it. It costs less than an invasion and leaves fewer headlines. The coffee market faced a predictable problem. It produced too much and too little at the same time. Too much during years of good harvests and new plantings, too little during years of frost, disease, or war. These price fluctuations didn't just affect farmers, they rippled through national budgets. This instability forced politicians to seek ways to reduce volatility, which sounds noble until you look at how they did it. They built agreements that functioned like cartels. They assigned quotas. They tried to manage supply. And they tied these quota decisions to diplomatic favors and Cold War strategy. Because coffee was never just coffee. It was a lever of influence disguised as breakfast. The era of quotas and control, the main tool of this era, was the International Coffee Agreement, ICA. The very name tells you the essence of the game. Nations sat down and negotiated how much coffee each could sell. They fixed export quotas. They aimed to keep prices within a target range. They did this because the alternative was chaos. A price crash could topple a government dependent on coffee revenue. A price spike could provoke inflation and resentment in consuming countries. And consuming countries also wanted predictability, as consumers do not tolerate sudden price jumps for basic products, without subsequent political fallout. So, both sides had a reason to cooperate. Yet, cooperation in raw commodity markets always has two faces. One face speaks of stability, the other of control. The United States played a central role not because it loved coffee more than anyone else, but because it feared instability in its hemisphere. During the Cold War, instability in Washington's view meant one thing: the possibility that a government might drift toward the Soviet bloc, or any ideology threatening American influence and corporate interests. Coffee exporting countries in Latin America were high stakes in this game because they were close. They were vulnerable, and they could change course. Therefore, the United States supported quota systems and price supports when those systems kept friendly regimes afloat, and they insisted on policy changes when those systems threatened American buyers, or when Washington decided it could get a better deal elsewhere. This is the core of the sense of conspiracy in coffee. The drink seems apolitical. The market is not. To understand how deep this goes, you must accept an uncomfortable fact. Many coffee-producing countries built their economies on a crop. They did not control on the global market. They controlled the land and labor at home. They did not control the price set on distant exchanges and in boardrooms. When the price fell, governments either cut services, borrowed money, or squeezed producers even harder. This squeeze generates social unrest, and unrest generates political opportunities for rebels, coups, or interventions supported from the outside. You see how neatly coffee fits into the general model of resource dependency. It behaves like oil for poor countries without the same headlines. Because coffee sits on breakfast tables and seems harmless. This harmlessness makes it easier for powerful players to manipulate it without public outcry. The collapse and the rise of the corporate empire. The International Coffee Agreement held the system together for a time. Prices remained relatively stable. Exporting countries received income that allowed for some planning. Consuming countries enjoyed predictable supplies. But the agreement also created winners and losers. Because quotas determine who can expand and who must sit still. Countries wanting to grow production often resented the limits, while those with large quotas fiercely defended them. Inside countries, elites controlling export channels benefited more than small farmers. As price supports didn't always reach the bottom, brokers and exporters took the margin. Politicians used coffee revenue for patronage. In some places, local leaders treated coffee like a personal bank, as one controlled export can fund an entire network of loyalty. Then the system cracked because every cartel faces the same temptation: cheating. Coffee producers always had reasons to bypass quotas. A producer with a large harvest wants to sell more. A government needing cash wants to export more. Enforcement mechanisms were limited. Once cheating became commonplace, the agreement lost credibility. Consuming countries also began to push back. They wanted cheaper coffee. They wanted freedom from quotas. They wanted a market that served buyers more than producers. By the end of the 1980s, the agreement collapsed. This collapse triggered a price war that devastated producers. When quotas vanish, supply floods the market, prices plummet, and farmers relying on coffee suddenly find that the world values their labor at a small fraction of what they need to survive. The collapse did not happen in a vacuum. It occurred in an ideological environment favoring deregulation and market liberalization. The same wave that hit finance hit raw commodities, and coffee became another victim of the belief that markets always distribute efficiently. Efficiency in this context meant that buyers get cheap coffee, producers absorb the risk, And the people preaching free markets do not live in villages, where price fluctuations mean children drop out of school to go to work. Consumers in consuming countries rarely link the price on the shelf with the price at the farm gate. Retail pricing includes branding, rent, marketing, cups, and cafe labor. These layers insulate consumers from the reality that a farmer may receive pennies for the raw product, while a corporation sells the processed product for many times more. This era also includes the rise of the modern coffee corporation as a cultural empire. Once the quota system weakened and markets opened, companies capable of global sourcing gained more power. They could switch suppliers. They could pit regions against each other. They could demand quality at low prices. They could build supply chains optimized for their own profit. The most famous corporate symbol of this shift is Starbucks. Not because Starbucks invented coffee, but because it perfected the idea of coffee as a branded experience, for which people would pay daily. When a company convinces millions to buy premium price coffee, it creates a river of cash that eclipses what most producers ever see. This gives the company leverage in politics, labor markets, and cultural norms. The specialty narrative and the modern maze. Starbucks rose because it sold a narrative of the third place, a spot between home and work where you could sit and display your identity. That identity came with a cup in your hand sporting a logo. The logo mattered because branding turned coffee into a statement. Statements create loyalty. Loyalty gives pricing power. And pricing power allows a company to aggressively shape supply chains. When you control consumer demand, you can dictate terms at the entry point, you can demand certifications, specific varieties, and contract enforcement, while shifting costs to producers under the cover of the language of quality and sustainability. This is where modern ethical debates become tangled. Certification systems like fair trade emerged partly as a reaction to the collapse of price stability. Consumers began to hear about farmer poverty, child labor, and environmental damage. Activists pushed for better practices. Companies responded with labels and programs. Some of these programs improved conditions for some farmers. Yet, the overall structure remained the same. The market still set the prices. Corporations still controlled the branding. And farmers still lived at the mercy of weather, disease, and global price swings. Many certifications created new costs and requirements that small farmers struggled to meet, meaning benefits often flowed to well-organized cooperatives, while the most marginal producers remained excluded. Corporate sustainability programs often function as brand reputation insurance. They allow companies to say the right words and show photos of smiling farmers. They allow consumers to feel less uncomfortable, but they don't necessarily change the underlying profit distribution. Profit distribution depends on bargaining power, and bargaining power depends on who controls capital and access to consumers, and the companies control that. When a company can buy from many sources, it can threaten to leave a region if producers demand higher prices. A producer cannot easily threaten to stop producing without losing their livelihood. The negotiation is not equal. It never was. The whip changed form. It became a contract and a market signal. The rise of Vietnam as a coffee producer illustrates how geopolitics and development policy can quickly redraw the coffee map. Vietnam significantly expanded Robusta production in the late 20th century. Partly due to state policy and international support. The influx of Vietnamese coffee increased global supply and contributed to price drops in certain periods, hurting producers elsewhere, especially small farmers in Latin America and Africa, who could not compete on cost. It shows the brutal logic of the market. The developmental success of one country can become the rural crisis of another. The modern era of coffee power also includes the shift in how consumers relate to origin. The specialty coffee movement and the third wave brought origin stories back into marketing. Cafes began to list farm names, regions, and processing methods. They treated coffee like wine, offering tasting notes. In some cases, this created better prices for certain producers. However, it also created a new hierarchy, where a small portion of high-quality coffee received attention. and premium prices, while the bulk of the world's coffee remained a low-margin commodity sold in blends and instant products. The specialty narrative sometimes functioned as a boutique cover for a mass market that still relied on low prices and unequal power distribution. You can see the Neue dynamics in how the industry handles transparency. Brands love to show a farmer holding a basket of cherries. Brands rarely show the ledger. Brands rarely show the real breakdown of how a $5 cup is divided among the landowner, the cafe, the roaster, the importer, the exporter, and the farmer. When journalists try to follow the money, they hit layers of intermediaries, contracts, and closed pricing, because opacity protects the margin, and opacity also protects the reputation. A company can talk about ethical sourcing without revealing if it pays enough for the farmer to cover costs, and the consumer has little leverage because the consumer rarely has the time to audit a supply chain before work. Coffee also intersects with internal politics in consuming countries, because companies shape the working conditions in cafes and warehouses. They fight unions, they manage schedules, they control wages, and these labor battles trace back to the same logic as upstream: control costs, protect margins, maintain pricing power. A labor dispute in a Seattle cafe may seem unrelated to a farmer in Guatemala, and yet, both are inside the same system that treats labor as a cost to be minimized and views branding as the place for investment. The gap between what companies spend on marketing and what they pay at the point of origin tells you where the power is concentrated. This chapter is not a morality play. It is a map of how coffee embedded itself into global power structures. Coffee exporting countries became dependent. Consuming countries gained leverage. Corporations built empires on branding. Financial markets turned beans into paper bets. And the collapse of international stabilization agreements exposed farmers to volatility that many could not survive without debt and deprivation. All of this continues because coffee seems mundane. It is poured into a mug and looks harmless. People do not like to think of their morning habits as part of a geopolitical machine. A person in a clean apron draws a neat leaf on foam and hands over a cup that costs more than a farm worker earns in a day in many coffee regions. And no one in line asks the only important question: who took the hits so that this cup could seem like a small luxury, rather than a complex supply chain with debt baked into it? Because modern coffee no longer hides its problems in the dark. It hides them in plain sight, under the glow of a menu that promises ethics, origin, and community, while the system beneath it still works on the old math. Start with the split defining this era. Coffee has turned into two industries that share the same raw material and almost nothing else. The mass market sells cheap caffeine on a large scale through supermarkets, drive-thrus, office machines, capsules, instant granules, and branded blends that hide their origin. The specialty market sells story and identity through single origin bags, tasting notes, pour-over rituals, barista championships, micro-lots, farm names, and language that makes coffee sound like fine wine. Both markets draw from the same world of farms and weather. Both markets depend on the same harvest cycles and the same vulnerable hands. Nevertheless, they distribute money in radically different ways. And even the specialty side, claiming to pay better, still works within a global pricing system that shifts risk downward. Risk starts on the farm because coffee grows slowly and punishes impatience. A farmer plants trees and waits years for a meaningful harvest. Then the farmer must maintain the grove through drought, pests, disease, price fluctuations, and political instability. The farmer cannot simply switch crops when the market changes, because coffee trees do not move. The land does not move, and many farmers have no extra land anyway. So the farmer takes out loans to buy seedlings, fertilizers, tools, and to pay for labor. Then the farmer prays that the harvest covers the debt. Debt turns into the quiet manager of modern coffee because debt does not scream. Debt simply sits at the table every season and demands payment, regardless of whether the market is favorable or not. Now look at how the market sets the tone. A significant part of the global coffee trade still looks to the commodity benchmark, which rewards volume and punishes small producers who cannot hedge risks, cannot store goods, cannot wait out a bad year, and cannot negotiate from a position of strength. When the benchmark price falls below a farmer's cost of production, the farmer does not negotiate with the market. The farmer absorbs the loss or abandons the harvest. Abandoning a harvest does not look like a dramatic collapse. It looks like neglected trees, unpaid pickers, children taken out of school to help in the fields, and migration to cities or across borders because people do not stop needing money. When coffee becomes unprofitable, they simply stop being able to earn it where they live. Companies understand this and still sell coffee using moral language, because moral language sells well at retail. A bag claiming responsibility costs more. A cafe claiming to support farmers attracts customers who want a clean conscience, along with their caffeine. So brands developed a plan of action. They slap a seal on the bag. They add a line about direct relationships. They show the farmer's face. They mention sustainability. They publish a glossy report. And they keep the numbers vague, because numbers invite scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens marketing. This is where greenwashing finds its home, not just in lies, but in a selective truth that gives the consumer a story without giving the consumer a ledger. Certifications tried to fill this gap and yielded mixed results. Some cooperatives use certification premiums to fund community projects or improve processing. Some farmers gain access to buyers who pay more. In some regions, better infrastructure is built. Nevertheless, the certification system often requires fees, audits, documents, and compliance steps that small farmers struggle to afford. When a farmer cannot afford the paperwork, they cannot access the label. When a farmer cannot access the label, they remain trapped in the commodity market. Thus, labeling can inadvertently reward those farmers who already have better organization and leave behind those facing the harshest conditions. Even when certification works as intended, it rarely changes the core structure where the consumer pays a premium, and the farmer receives a small fraction of that premium, after everyone else takes their cut for processing, export, import, roasting, packaging, rent, labor, marketing, and profit. The specialty market promises a different model through direct trade and relationship-based sourcing. This model can raise farm gate prices for certain producers. Nevertheless, it has limits that the industry does not like to publicize. Specialty buyers purchase a small fraction of global supplies. The rest still moves through ordinary channels. And specialty buyers still demand quality and uniformity that require investment. Investment, again, often requires debt. Thus, a farmer may get a better price and still end up with fragile finances if one bad harvest ruins the quality. Quality can collapse for reasons that have nothing to do with skill. A storm can knock off flowers. Drought can delay cherry growth. Fungus can spread. A labor shortage can delay picking, and delayed picking can ruin a cup score. Thus, the modern specialty narrative sells control, while the farm reality brings constant insecurity. Climate pressure is now turning insecurity into a permanent crisis. Coffee, especially Arabica, grows best in narrow temperature ranges. As temperatures rise and rainfall patterns change, many traditional growing zones face increasing stress. Farmers see irregular flowering, unpredictable harvest times, higher pest pressure, and increasingly frequent extreme events. The industry responds with talk of resilience, climate-smart agriculture, carbon offsets, and new varieties. Some of these efforts help. Nevertheless, they also create a new form of inequality, because adaptation costs money, irrigation costs money, shade management costs money, replanting costs money, training costs money, and the farmers with the least money face the highest climate risk. Thus, the system asks the most vulnerable people to fund the adaptation of a product that generates huge retail margins, and this mismatch is not a natural disaster. It is a political choice made by every player who could share the risk and chose not to. The labor story in modern coffee is not in the past tense. It is in the present. Coffee still relies on seasonal labor that often lacks legal protection. In some regions, recruiters move workers like cargo. They promise wages, then they subtract pay through fees, transport, and housing costs, and the worker ends up trapped. Child labor still appears in coffee supply chains in several countries, not because children love farming, but because families lack cash and need hands to meet quotas. When brands claim they have clean supply chains, they often rely on audits that struggle to detect what families hide out of fear. Brands also rely on complex networks of intermediaries that blur responsibility. A brand buying through several layers can always claim it didn't know, and ignorance remains the cheapest shield of liability in commodity markets. Then you have a new mechanism of control: data and traceability. The industry now speaks of blockchain, farm mapping, satellite monitoring, digital payments, and end-to-end transparency. Yes, technology can reduce fraud and improve traceability. Nevertheless, it can also shift power toward whoever controls the platforms. Because data becomes a currency, a farmer sharing data may gain access to a buyer. Nevertheless, that farmer also reveals business details and land information that a powerful buyer can use to negotiate harder. The farmer often does not own the system that stores and monetizes this data. Thus, the industry can build a layer of surveillance claiming to protect farmers, while it tightens control oversourcing. Regulators have begun to push companies to prove their claims of sustainability and human rights, and new rules in several markets now force firms to document the origin of goods and cut links to deforestation and forced labor. Compliance can lead to real improvements when it forces companies to map their suppliers. Nevertheless, it can also lead to exclusion, because the burden of compliance falls heaviest on smallholders, who cannot easily provide the documents, maps, and official titles. When a company fears legal risk, it may simply stop buying from smallholders and switch to larger estates, or regions with cleaner paperwork. This shift can push the most vulnerable farmers off official markets, which does not end harmful production, it simply makes it harder to see. Now let's return to the consumer end. Because modern coffee also runs on a cultural engine that shapes demand, social media has turned coffee into a performance. A bag of beans becomes a status object, a latte becomes content, a cafe becomes a stage set, and the third wave scene sells the idea that knowledge equals virtue, that if you know the farm and the processing method, you have done your duty. This idea allows people to confuse awareness with influence, because knowledge in itself does not change the distribution of value. Bargaining power changes the distribution of value. A consumer can memorize tasting notes and still finance a system that pays farmers too little, because the consumer does not negotiate the farm gate price. Companies and traders do, and companies and traders are still optimizing margins unless a force more powerful than sentimentality compels them to do otherwise. Corporate consolidation reinforces this logic. A small number of large trading houses and roasters control vast volumes, and they manage risk through hedging and diversification. They shift sourcing across continents when weather hits one region. They renegotiate contracts. They blend. They substitute Arabica with Robusta in certain products when prices rise. And the consumer often doesn't notice because brands adjust roast profiles and flavoring to keep the product familiar. This ability to switch sources gives large buyers leverage over producers, because the buyer can threaten to leave, while the farmer cannot easily threaten to stop production. Even cooperatives that conduct collective bargaining still face a market where buyers can wait, and producers cannot. This era also contains a cruel irony. The parts of the coffee business that fetch high prices often depend on labor-intensive processing and meticulous manual sorting, which means the quality premium requires more labor, not less. In many places, farmers incur higher labor costs to achieve higher quality. They then hope the buyer recognizes the quality and pays enough to cover these expenses. When a buyer rejects a lot due to minor defects, the farmer may lose the premium while still carrying the added costs. Thus, specialty can increase risk even as it increases the potential reward. This creates a psychological trap where farmers chase quality, like gamblers chase a win, because they need an exit from commodity pricing, and the industry welcomes their ambition while leaving them unprotected. Look at how the industry talks about the future, and you will hear the word scarcity. Analysts warn that climate change will reduce suitable land, that demand in new markets will grow, and that prices will skyrocket. Companies use the scarcity narrative in two ways. They use it to justify raising retail prices, and they use it to justify investments in new varieties, new origins, and more resilient supply chains. However, the scarcity narrative rarely includes the obvious solution: paying farmers more consistently so they can maintain their farms and invest in adaptation. Paying more reduces margins unless the company raises prices or accepts less profit. Many companies would rather sell fear than share the margin. In this chapter on the modern industry, we also need to talk about the quiet exit of farmers from the coffee business, because the most important indicator of the system's health is not the number of cafes in cities. It is the willingness of young people in growing regions to stay on the land. In many regions, young people look at coffee and see volatility, hard labor, low returns, and debt. Then they choose other paths if they can. When they can't, they migrate anyway. Migration robs rural areas of labor and knowledge, which can reduce production and raise costs, forcing companies to seek new origins, which then starts new communities on the same treadmill. The treadmill keeps moving because global demand keeps growing, and the retail link keeps printing money. Brands respond with campaigns that look like an admission of guilt, but act like insurance. They publish impact reports. They announce farmer support programs. They invest in training centers. They fund seedling purchases. They launch pilot projects. These efforts may help individuals. However, they often function as public relations shields against structural criticism. A pilot project does not change the pricing system. A training program does not erase debt. A new seedling does not pay school fees this year. When a brand funds a program, it often presents it as generosity, rather than part of the cost of doing business ethically. Generosity implies a voluntary act. Cost implies an obligation, and companies prefer the language of voluntarism because it protects flexibility. At the same time, activists, journalists, and some producer groups have begun to push for new models: living income benchmarks, transparent contracts, long-term purchasing commitments, profit sharing, and more direct ownership of value-adding stages like milling, exporting, roasting, and branding in producing countries. The fundamental problem isn't that coffee grows in poor places. The fundamental problem is that most of the value accumulates far from where the crop is grown, and shifting value requires restructuring who owns the processing, who owns the logistics, who owns the brands, and who has access to consumers. Such a shift threatens entrenched interests. Therefore, it moves slowly and meets resistance disguised as concerns over quality control, traceability, and market efficiency. Modern coffee also has a propaganda problem on the consumer side, because consumers now face an overabundance of choice: capsules, instant coffee, ready-to-drink cans, cold brew, nitro, single origin blends, light roasts, dark roasts, sugar-free syrups, functional additives, mushroom coffee, protein coffee. Each new product form adds margin and increases the distance from the farm. The more distance a product establishes between the consumer and the origin, the easier it becomes to hide labor conditions and pricing. A flavored drink in a can does not raise questions about the farm gate price. It raises questions about calories. Companies prefer questions they can answer with nutritional labels over those they would prefer not to answer at all. So, the modern industry looks like this. Technology increases traceability and can also increase control. Climate change raises risk and shifts costs down the chain. Certification and ethical sourcing may help, or may become marketing armor. Specialty creates premiums and creates new volatility. Corporate consolidation reinforces buyer power, and consumers keep buying because coffee functions as a daily survival tool. In a world built on stress and schedules, this function provides the industry with a steady stream of demand that smooths over outrage, because outrage rarely survives until the morning when someone needs caffeine and has 10 minutes left before work.